how mature is your conversational AI process? Which is a question that I think I've heard a lot. I know Daniel, our guest, has heard a lot. I'll intro you in a second. But I know a lot of people who are joining today or watching on the recording after. It's a question that you're asking of your teams, of yourself, and of maybe your larger company with an industry that's continuing to mature very quickly. So it's a conversation we need to have right now. So let's hop in. First off, I'll reintroduce myself for anyone who's new from last week. My name is Sam. I'm on the marketing team. I'm the moderator, host of this expert conversation series, and very excited to have some very smart people join me every 2 weeks or so here. And that smart person this week is Daniel D'Souza. Daniel, welcome. Very happy to have you here.
So cool. Hey everyone. Thanks Sam for the intro. So my name is Daniel. I lead the customer experience team here at Voiceflow. So that's really kind of working with all of our clients, everyone from small, medium businesses all the way up to Fortune 100, Fortune 50 companies. So really being able to see a wide range of conversation design teams and conversation design processes. Where my role is and where my day-to-day is, in addition to kind of leading the team, is also spending a ton of time just working with our customers in two aspects. So one of them is getting in the weeds and helping them kind of optimize the designs they have right now using Voiceflow, et cetera. But the other one is really kind of being consultative on their process. Because I get to work with so many amazing teams across different verticals, so people from the restaurant industry all the way to finance, all the way to automotive, I get to see a lot of best practices and how different conversation design teams are set up, and where design teams and how design teams work with development teams, data science teams, product teams to actually create a full product to launch. And so just giving a sense of what that kind of client list looks like. Again, a wide variety of people that I get to work with on a day-to-day basis. So everyone from Home Depot who's using us for their kind of IVR, to Google using us for personal assistants, to Mattel for voice-enabled toys, to McDonald's for drive-thrus, to BMW for in-car assistants, US Bank, JP Morgan. So really almost every vertical that you can think of, and a wide range of teams.
Yeah, and I think you hit that on the head where it's not like we're you're not coming up with this maturity conversation from scratch, right? You're hearing these questions on a day-to-day basis, and I think we're very excited to kind of have you walk us through the conversations you're having more in a formal capacity. So why don't you take us through maybe what anyone who's watching here live or after the fact is maybe could get from this?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've done is just over the past, I guess, a year or so, being able to work with a lot of these clients, we've been able to kind of see trends of where different teams are at different points. And from that, we've been able to really put together almost like a maturity scale. So different stages that different conversation design processes or conversational AI processes are in. And this is really across vertical. And so we're seeing the same trends happen in automotive, in retail, in banking. And we've kind of grouped them into 5 main stages. And so on this call, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through those 5 stages. So you'll be able to, at the end of it, understand where you're at or where your conversational AI process is on this maturity scale, and also understand what questions you need to ask to move forward to that next part. And both of those are pretty critical in really kind of understanding what the next step is and how you grow your conversation design practice. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on this call.
Perfect. So then let's look at that scale from scratch here and maybe walk us through. Obviously, we'll go a little bit deeper at each one, but from a 10,000 foot view, what are we looking at here for maturity?
Yeah, for sure. And feel free to put, as we go through each of these, feel free to drop questions in the chat. Feel free to just kind of jump in, whatever makes the most sense for anyone here. This is really just meant to be helpful for you and your processes. And so starting off on the level 0, you have out of the box. And so we'll dive into each of these. But out of the box is very much, you don't have any conversational AI processes or team. You're just using a kind of out of the box solution to kind of provide something basic for your customers. Moving forward to outsourced, we're outsourcing the process to being very developer heavy. And then also to the bottom level where you're emerging, you start to have an emerging conversation design team, an established one and an optimized one. So the way to think about this is there's almost 2 levels that we see teams at. The top level is really where teams are either they're either using an external agency or they themselves are just building it, but the processes are very developer led. And so there's not a lot of UX input or not a lot of design or user testing into that process. So that's that kind of first category. The second category is the bottom level of teams that are starting to invest in their UX process and are really starting to shift the emphasis from just being able to build and launch conversational AI product to actually optimize and improve it and try to create the best user experience. And so those are the two kind of categories, but we're going to go through each of these stages and kind of talk about them in more depth.
Yeah, and when you say categories too, just for visual people, really those first three on that top level is kind of that dev experience, right? Or like the out of the box. But then that second level or the row two is really where we see teams start to thrive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I'll try to give as much kind of vague examples as I can without naming any names as we go through. But I think most teams and most companies are really somewhere between kind of level 1 to 4. There's very few who are kind of getting to this level 5 stage. So even some of the kind of leading companies that you can imagine in your mind who have very advanced conversational AI teams and processes are really still trying to figure out how to kind of optimize their overall system. So you've got a team, but they're really trying to build an organization around conversation design. And so think about almost like a curve between 1 and 4, where most teams are really around 2 and 3. A lot less teams are at 4, and very few teams are at 5. And so we're starting to see this kind of movement as we go through them.
David had a good question just for vocab as we go, as you've used this word a couple of times. When you say team, right? Do you mean in-house only teams, or what can a team be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when I say team, I kind of just mean the group of people that's involved in actually creating and pushing a conversational AI product to market. And that team can take many different forms as we go through it. And so you'll see in the outsource category, the majority of that team is actually outsourced. So it's an out-of-house team, whether it's an agency or a consultancy or a tech company. Whereas a team an organization that might be at level 4 will have much more of an in-house team. And so team being kind of broad in the sense, but you also see the structure that teams start to change as organizations move through these stages.
Yeah. Okay, great. So then as we go into this next section, we're going to break down each one with a few ideas of what categorizes you there. But I think what we meant these slides to be is very screenshotable, right? Whether live or after the fact, that you can actually bring to your team or consider after the fact as like a resource, right? So just keep that in mind as we go. So let's jump into level 0 out of the box.
Yeah, so I'll be super quick on this one because I think we're going to spend most of our time in the level 2 to 4. But out of the box is an organization at this stage doesn't really have a team. There might be someone who's responsible for this product, but really they're using out-of-box solutions. So whether that's a chatbot, whether that's voice, like IVR system, whatever it is, something that they just purchased and launched. So there's minimal customization really in here. There's no internal conversation designers. There's no technology or dev team that's really managing it. It's just a product that they've kind of plugged in. And so that's the most simple stages of an organization that's just starting to get into conversation design, but does not have a team that's actually focused on producing it.
Okay, great. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So then 0, we find other teams maybe at this level 1, right? Which would be that outsource category. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, and so this is, as organizations start to get more complex, there's a lot more needs when it comes to their actual conversational AI product, right? And so when I say this, it can be anything from a chatbot to an assistant to an IVR. It's really channel agnostic because we see this across every industry. But the previous stage, level 0, is usually seen, or we see at least in small, medium businesses who don't necessarily have a lot of complexity. They want to be able to, take a customer feedback and send it to an email or kind of send an automated message. Outsource is really where you start to get into larger organizations. These might be large Fortune 500 companies. They might be 1,000. Any kind of enterprise company that has complexity in their system, right? They want to plug into backend processes. They want to plug into real databases. They want to be able to sift through customer information. So they need some sort of customizability, but their organization is very early in terms of being able to put this in-house. And so their conversation design team is almost entirely outsourced. So you may have 1 or 2 folks internally who are usually kind of project managers or business analysts who are responsible for taking a business problem and coordinating with an agency or a partner. And then what you also see is that most of the actual development work or kind of optimizing the design work actually comes from the agency or the partner themselves. And so this is usually a way that a lot of teams get started with actually being able to have a conversational AI product. It is really easy. It is quick. There's a ton of really good agencies and partners out there who were able to actually build these systems and implement them. But in terms of actually looking at this from an organizational level, Sam, if you want to go to the next slide, I think. Yeah. This is typically what it starts to look like. So you have the business. You usually have a project manager or a business analyst that's associated with the problem. This might be contact center. This might be some other sort of assistant. And this project manager, business analyst, is usually the one who's taking in the business problem. They might be creating a flow chart of here's what the initial process should look like. They have a good sense of how their systems work internally, but most of the work is then done by a third party. And so they'll partner with an organization that's then working with this project manager or business analyst to look at the designs, understand the systems fit, but actually do the development, the hosting, and the implementation. And typically with these, the technology itself is actually controlled by the third party. And so they're working within their own limitations in terms of what they can actually create.
Yeah, and you hit on something there, right? This is the first time we'll bring in this is like the technology, the talent, and then the design, right? So if someone is at that level one, right, they're in this call, they're looking at it later, and they're like, oh, I identify as I use outsource, but I want to move to more of a dev-led, for example. What are some of the considerations there in that top graphic that you have here?
Yeah. And so typically what we see is like, teams usually move from that stage where they're just using it out of the box and need something more complex. So they bring in an agency or consultancy or a tech partner. This might be like a Microsoft or like a Nuance or an AWS Connect, like whoever it might be, to actually just build the system for them. But there's a lot of challenges that come with this. And this is what we see with teams that are going from a kind of outsourced model where most of their technology is outsourced to actually being able to bring it in-house. There's a few issues that they go through. The first one is the business impact of not having control of the end product. And so a lot of times what we see from this is because the technology is not the organization's technology, there is a limit in terms of what they're able to do. And so a lot of the times an organization, may want to have, free text, free speech, like be able to kind of use NLUs and have kind of open-ended conversations with customers over the phone. But some of the times the organizations that they're partnering with, their technology may not be able to support that. And so a lot of the times there is kind of frustration between, I think, the business side and the technology side in terms of, this is what we want to be able to do, but we're working within the limitations of someone else's system. Yeah. And so that's one of, I think, the biggest challenges that really encourages teams or kind of prompts teams to go from an outsourced model to being a developer-led model. And so those are really around the limitations of the technology. Some of the questions that I would kind of prompt someone to ask at this stage, right? If you're thinking about how do I kind of bring this in-house, or how do I start growing our organizations like conversational AI repertoire or kind of capabilities, is what's the impact of not having control over your end product? What are the limitations that exist with a third-party vendor that prevent you from modernizing? What is the vision that you have for an in-house team, and what are the cost savings from an in-house team compared to an agency? Because a lot of the times, being able to have someone, a partner who's actually building it out for you might work great at the beginning, but as an organization starts to scale, costs might rise as well, and costs plus limitations usually equals a lot of frustration. Yeah. So that's what we see in this transition.
And we'll hit on some of these core questions on each of these transition slides, right? And I think the one that I think anyone who is actually ready to do this, I think sometimes it's hard because you look at it and be like, I want to go from 0 to 5 right now, right? But in reality, if you can tactically answer these 4 questions, you're pretty set up to go from 1 to 2, right? Like you just need to be able to quantify that in your internal company speak and in what measurements are impactful, and you can actually start to make legitimate traction towards leveling up. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like this is also just really what we've seen across the org. I think when you start looking at individual organizations, the actual structure varies quite differently. Some teams have an outsourced conversation design team and then has tech team. Some teams have an outsourced tech team and then has conversation design team. And so it's pretty flexible in the way that you think about it, but definitely agree.
Okay, cool. So let's hop over to Devled, which honestly, sometimes we've seen teams start here, right? Where they're just now Devled because of the size of the company, and it could be a massive, well-known brand, but what does level 2 look like that some teams are actually just starting at?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where you actually see a ton of companies. So organizations who are either building their systems in-house start here, or a lot of organizations that already have existing systems are here as well. And really kind of any company that has a big, at least what we've seen, this is pretty agnostic for like channel-wise, but we usually see a lot of contact centers in the space just because they're a much older system and they've built out a really robust process in-house. But level 2 is dev-led. And so what this means is that you've been able to kind of take the development process or the technical process of actually hosting and building a conversational AI product, and you brought that in-house. And some of the kind of telltale signs that you're at this stage is that most of the resources of this organization are on the developer side. And so these usually entail very large tech teams or very large tech acquisitions to be able to host the technology team. And usually you might have minimal emphasis on the kind of UX side. And so, you might still have a business analyst or someone with the title of project manager who's actually doing the flow charting, doing the designs, and they usually just kind of ship off a design to the dev team via product manager in Jira, and they never see it again. And so that's really what it looks like at this stage. I think there's definitely a lot of pros and cons. When you look at the pros, someone who's just come from an outsource side, you have a lot more flexibility because you have a dev team in-house. You're able to actually build out a system that works best for you, pick the technologies that you think are best to be able to suit the needs that you have. Obviously, it comes with a lot of complexity of being able to actually structure that development team, have people actually work together. And if you haven't really built a system like this before, it might be quite challenging. But at this stage, most resources are placed on the development side, and developers are building the experience from scratch. And so you might find teams in various stages of this. So a team might just be starting an in-house development team, or you might have a much larger company that had an in-house development team and has kind of built on top of the tools that they've created. Yeah. And so some of the challenges here are, as you start to build your in-house processes and you start to grow, a lot of the times you find that you might make kind of patches, changes, kind of homegrown solutions on top of this that might work really well at the stage that you're at. But as you start to grow, slowly start to create limitations, challenges, points of failure that start to impact everyone else in that process. And so usually this works out really well to start, but also ends up creating challenges as the team starts to grow. And so this is what it looks like. And so it's very similar to the previous design with the outsourced technology team, except now you have a large development team in-house. And you'll notice that on this slide too, the development team is just, it's one bucket. And that's usually because all the different parts of the conversational AI process, such as like NLU, data science, dialogue management, et cetera, are all being done by the same team. And so that's really one of the kind of marquee points of this is, what is the size of the UX team or the design team compared to the development team? Is there even a design team, or is it just a project manager? Is there any user testing being done, or is it very much business problem, let's create a solution, and then someone actually has to build it before they go and test? But this is kind of how you can identify that you're at this stage.
And yeah, I think what I'm hearing too is and what we've seen is that teams of this type are focused on going to production and getting things high fidelity in production, live, go, right? There's less thought about maybe customer insights or how we're going to attach it or how can we test leading up to that, right? And it's more about going to production, as best as possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with this as well, this really kind of depends on the team, but typically there's not a lot of user testing at this stage. And so, for me, someone who's very kind of design driven or user oriented driven, a lot of the times what you find is that a business problem comes in terms of, we need to spin up a new line, or we have a problem where one of the lines is down, or we see an issue where there's a lot of drop off, or there's not enough containment, et cetera. And so the PM or the kind of business analyst or whoever's doing the design looks at that problem, creates a solution, but they don't really have the means to do any user testing, because to be able to turn that solution into something that works means that a developer has to build it. And so by the time it's actually being built or being tested, it's mainly being tested for functionality, and then it's being pushed right to the line itself. And so this works in terms of actually being able to create something that works for business and push it out. But what you quickly start to see is as you start to grow, there's no way to really optimize this because the only way to really test something is if you have developer resources. And most of the developer resources are focused on production. And so you end up having this system where you're kind of just fixing issues that come up and being able to kind of push them live without being able to do a lot of testing beforehand, which is also another reason why there isn't really a large UX or kind of conversation design team at this stage of a company, is because most of the resources are focused on the development team, and anything on the design is really kind of flowchart based to solve a very specific problem. Yeah.
So then we hit on some of the core cons there, that why a team might say, okay, we have to get past this Devled, right, and really get to an emerging CXD practice, going from, as you see here, where yes, you own the tech and some UX, to actually having a tech team and full UX, right, or full an actual conversation design practice. Some of the questions here that I thought were very, very interesting, because this is where we see where you go from that top 0, 1, 2 to now actually going into a practice, right? These are some of the biggest questions a team needs to ask one another. Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest distinctions, and I would say most companies are kind of at this stage where they're trying to figure out, okay, we have a very developer-led process. We have a big development team, but we're starting off a UX team, or we're trying to figure out what we can do here. With that comes a lot of challenges, right? Because as you're starting a new department, or you're trying to make the argument for a UX team in an area where all the resources are on the development side, you need to know what questions to ask to be able to start having people think about what the impact could be if you're focused on the design side, if you have a larger UX team. And so I think when you look at like this level 2 and level 3, the titles at the top give a good sense of what this looks like, where level 2 is tech and some UX, and level 3 is a tech team plus UX. So more UX, and the tech team also starts to become more defined. And so some of those kind of core questions are like, what are the core business metrics that can be optimized with better UX? And so usually what we see at this stage is you've got a system in place, right? Some sort of conversational AI product that is live in market with hundreds of thousands of users a month, being able to actually call and interact with it. And so you have an opportunity to say, at that volume, there's going to be parts of what you're building where if you can increase the efficiency by 1% to 2%, you're saving millions of dollars or hundreds of millions to the business. And so what that looks like is really kind of better UX, or a better user experience to be able to capture some of those drop-off points, better answer customer questions, better route them to the right areas before you may have to connect them to a real person, or before they kind of just leave because their problem wasn't solved. And so what are the core business metrics that can be optimized with better UX is a core question that you should always be asking yourself, because that's really where you're able to turn a UX ask into dollars. The other ones are, where are we lacking as an organization compared to our competitors? And so what we see a lot is that a lot of the teams that are dev-led, just by means of how complex their teams are, their processes aren't necessarily as modern as some of the teams that are more ahead, who might be at level 3 or level 4. In the world of chatbots, these are very simple chatbots that are button-driven, maybe answer a couple questions and then log a user's information. In the world of like a phone system, these are phone systems that traditionally have to be button-driven, again, like DTMF. And so a lot of these teams are trying to figure out, like, how do we modernize our systems and be where our competitors are at, which might be kind of smaller, more nimble organizations, knowing that we have a ton of technical debt or kind of really in-house systems that might be very complex to move and change. And so that's another question as well, is how can we just bring an experience that puts us at a bar of another competitor? And then kind of going down through this too, right? So how can we be more proactive and data-driven with improvements to our conversational AI product? A lot of what you find, or a lot of what we see in this level 2 is that it's very problem-driven, where it's reactive, where there's a problem, there's an issue with the actual production system. So a ticket gets filed, goes to the business, goes back down to a project manager, business analyst, comes up with a solution to it, and then ships it again. And this business person is usually swamped with work. They're pumping out flowcharts left, right, and center. And there's no time to actually be proactive to identify and look at the data and say, where can we perhaps better match users? How can we better redesign the system to provide a better user experience? And so that's another driving factor, is being able to actually be proactive and data-driven. So you're not just solving problems, you're actually actively improving the end user experience.
Yeah, it's not about just standing things up. It's about standing the right things up, right? And I think that's where you start to actually, the word emerging is interesting, because it's not only emerging in your practice, but it's emerging as a business, emerging as an offering, right? And I think you need to think about it, not just the conversational AI team, it's the work you're putting out as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's two other parts of this as well, right? Like the first one is being able to introduce user testing into your process. So being able to actually test what you're building with real users before it's actually built by developers and pushed live is something that we find being introduced at this stage. And so if you find that your organization isn't necessarily doing user testing, you might be leaning closer to level 2 than you are level 3. And then the last point is like leveraging conversation design tooling. And so a lot of teams are still working on tools that they've been using since the 90s when it comes to flowchart creation. But there's a ton of other conversation design tools that are out there today that actually allow teams to do this prototyping without needing to kind of have a developer be involved. And so those are all things to start thinking about at this stage. But again, it's really the emergence of UX as a formal entity within that conversation AI process. And the other part, Sam, if you want to hit, next one. And then I think I'm just going to summarize a lot of that stuff in the one after, actually.
This was right. You saying go to emerging, or?
Yeah, go to that next slide.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so we kind of summarized a lot of this, right? So when you're at this stage, you likely have a small conversation design team, potentially aligned to different channels or products. You're starting to stand up a conversation design practice. Typically at the stage 2, we see a couple other quirks. So we find that conversation design isn't necessarily a term that's really well known at the organization. And so there might be UX, and there might be a couple of UX designers who might have an interest in conversational AI as a whole. And so that's another thing that we see, is that usually UX is the one that comes in with a couple of designers that might be familiar with conversational AI or have an interest in it. I think as we continue to grow, and even from a year ago to now, we're seeing more and more kind of like conversation design titles. And so as this starts to develop, we're going to see more of these become conversation design teams within a larger UX practice. But at this point, it's a little bit kind of mixed, but at least we've got kind of UX in the process.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I was kind of trying to touch on this one is that the tech team also starts to become more specialized. And so, Sam, if you go to the next slide.
Oh, right here.
Oh, that one. Okay, yeah. This is where we start to see the actual process become more of a cycle and more of a process and look more specialized than it did previously. And so now what you've got is not just kind of, business, some sort of project manager, business analyst, and a technology team, but you start to have a UX team start to be developed that is separate from the business. You start to have a product manager that is really kind of playing a more technical role between the design and the development stages. So someone who was in that kind of business analyst or that project management role that's now kind of focused less on being able to actually design the flow charts and more on the technical implementations of it. And you start to see the tech team specialize a bit. And so within here, you really see two buckets. So you've got the actual development team who's building the actual product itself, right? So they might be the ones either with managing the dialogue manager, connecting up the actual designs, or building the designs in code and connecting them to the actual databases and end systems that they need. But the part that gets separated out and usually starts to form on its own team is data science. And so at this stage, we're dealing with a ton of customer data. With this many people who are actually interacting with the products you create on a daily basis, there's a ton of data in terms of what can potentially be improved here. We also see teams at this stage start to adopt more modern practices. So they might be going, if you're a phone system, from dial tone, which is press 1 for this, press 2 for this, to more of an NLU-based model where it's much more open-ended conversation. Same thing with chatbots, same thing with voice assistants. And so there's a ton of other data around intents, entities, utterances that need to be managed in production and also can be analyzed to determine, how can we better match someone to what they're actually asking for. But a new team starts to form around that. And usually we see this team be called the data science team. There's also other names. We've seen bot trainer, we've seen CogOps. But really at the core, this team is dealing with the actual production data of what people are saying and how they're using the system. And what they're able to do is actually point out where there's opportunities for improvement. And so you start to see this cycle happen, which ends up really kind of creating a lot of efficiency. And so data science, if it's an existing problem in the current system, data science is able to identify an opportunity that the kind of business can improve on to improve the user experience. The business team determines if it's a priority, passes it to the product team evaluates it, see if it makes sense technically, pass it to the UX team. The UX team spends time now focused on that specific problem and understanding how they can restructure the design, introduce new intents, new entities, new conversational paths to better target that problem. And we see the introduction of user testing. And so this is pretty critical because what it does now is it allows the UX team to have a loop where they're able to create, test with actual users. And if you're a large enough consumer company, you're able to use tools like usertesting.com or UserZoom or any other testing tool to find people who know your business and actually have them go through it as if they were a real customer. And so it allows for a much tighter iteration loop. So by the time something is actually passed from the UX team back to the product team and back to the development team, there's a much higher degree of certainty that it's actually going to solve the business problem that it was originally focused on. And so you start to see, this is really where we see the biggest shift from organizations is when they move from level 2 to level 3 and they introduce that UX team or UX process. That's really where this starts turning from a kind of reactive problem solution to much more of a proactive cycle. And you see many improvements happening all the time with different parts of the overall experience, which then roll up to like much greater business goals, whether that's improving the customer experience or kind of hitting hard metrics like your containment or deflection, anything that kind of comes this way. So that's what we're kind of hard to see.
Yeah, that last 2.5 minutes, I think, should be like what everyone brings to their leadership, because like what you just described there is the pain points and exactly like what's possible, right? With going to this next level. And I think building off of what we heard last week from Peter at Willie's X, right? His original workflow was kind of like a straight line where like this point never talked to this point could never talk to this point. This is the first time in a workflow that now all of a sudden the data science work actually snowballs and impacts and benefits the user testing work, and vice versa, all the way around until a feature is in production and then back, right? So that cyclical motion, this is the first time you can actually unlock that. Everything else is just a straight kind of assembly line, production line.
Yeah, and that's a great example of like a great team that's kind of moved from that level 2 to level 3 stage, where they've been able to go from that kind of straight reactive, let me switch up flow charts, to being much more of the circle, which you also start to see a much stronger relationship between the design team and the product and development team. Because previously, where it was mainly very ticket focused, you now have the teams actually talking to each other, understanding their design, making sure everything is technically feasible, but kind of iterating earlier in the cycle than before, which was very waterfall-y, where it would be business problem designed, handoff, and then implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I think we hit on a lot of these questions probably that we just went through, but when a team's going from now that 3, right, they've unlocked this new workflow, but now all of a sudden, okay, hey, great, we're seeing results. We need to get to more of an established CXD practice. Those titles up top have now changed, right? Where you're going from tech team and UX to all of a sudden now tech team and conversation design team, right? So that's the biggest change that would happen in this next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that big jump between the level 2 and level 3 is really the establishment of like a UX org or a UX stakeholder within this process. And now once we're at that kind of second, so if you remember that the first 3 levels are on top, the bottom 3 levels are on the bottom. Now we start to focus on how can we continue to optimize and build on these processes. So we've gone from a tech team with some UX stakeholders to a tech team and a conversation design team. So you start to see the UX conversation design side start to be much more kind of fleshed out and formalized, and start to also specialize in different areas like content, design, UI, etc. And you also have the tech team, or in this case, the teach team, that is also starting to get more fleshed out, more specialized, and they're starting to work with each other a lot more.
Absolutely. And then the questions here, you had a few good questions. So like, what are ways that we can be proactive with customers? How can we use conversational AI to drive revenue instead of just reducing costs, right? Where reducing costs was the big metric at the last one you said. Now, this is the first time we're talking about customer insights, customer data, customer expectations, which we know are always going to outpace innovation, right? Expectations are always going to be there. We have to catch up with them. You have to ask that question, because otherwise competitor-wise, you will be left in the dust.
Yeah, and on this too, this is like, I think the best industry that we've seen be really forward-thinking in this is actually the financial services industry. So a lot of the big banks that we work with, the competition is just so hot in terms of, not just thinking about chatbots and kind of phone systems, but being able to provide a proactive user experience, whether it's in their phone, in their home, wherever it is, to make banking a part of someone's everyday life. And so this really took off during the pandemic, where all of a sudden people couldn't go into banks anymore. And so a lot of the kind of leading banks that are out there started thinking about how do you bring that experience to them in a proactive way. So someone doesn't have to think about like, oh, I'm going to open an account, let me go into the bank, or let me call into the bank. But you can actually identify customers who might be ready for that and prompt them right inside of your app, and then have an assistant experience to actually help them do that. These are just examples of some of the things that we see where a company really thinks about conversational AI, not just from a costing perspective, but really from a revenue driving perspective, as a way to improve that over like that customer experience and be proactive with how you're engaging with customers. And so that's really what we see in the banking space. And we're starting to see kind of slivers of it in really every other industry, from like retail to automotive, thinking about how do we not just, respond to user questions, but and not just be kind of, a glorified search function, but really be much more proactive and be a partner for them as they start to, deepen their experience or engagement with our business or with us as an organization.
Yeah.
So,
and that's going from that legacy offering to a more modern conversational AI offering too, right? Now you have the workflow to support that.
And that's where you see like teams who build products that really kind of stand out, because a lot of the teams who I think who are at this stage are really forward thinking. But more than that, they have the buy-in from the organization to be forward thinking. And really, you might see the product today, but knowing these organizations, like they had to go through a lot of these stages to be able to get to this point. And so now really kind of what they're focused on is spinning that wheel faster, right? So how do we start optimizing our collaboration process between our product, our data science, our design, our development team to launch products faster? We've got a good system here now. How do we spin the wheel quicker and quicker? How do we start using reusable components, right? So we've got our design team. Our design team is small but mighty. They're working on multiple projects, multiple channels. How do we enable them to actually move faster and allow them to be able to increase their efficiency with the more projects that they do, And how do we not only do that with design team, but how do we align that across our product and development team? So we're not constantly having to code or rebuild all these new functions, but are able to kind of reuse reusable components or start leveraging tools like no-code tools that allow the design team and the product team to really be able to work in sync together and design something, test it, and then launch it very quickly. And so that's what we start to see. And the last thing on this is we also start to see organizations at this stage start thinking about how to connect different parts of their customer journey. So before this stage, one of the classic things we find is that a lot of the channels you have are isolated, right? So voice, chat, assistants, whatever it might be, they're all thought of as different teams, sometimes under different product orgs that don't really talk to each other. But the kind of hallmark of a team at this stage is that they're thinking about actually being able to, one, establish common branding across all of their products. And so a customer is going through that experience is having the kind of same persona when they call in on the phone as they do chat. And the next stage is actually having cross-functional teams. So you might call into a phone system and then you might get a text and continue on the app itself. And so you start seeing much more of these cross-threaded projects that a customer is engaging with an assistant or engaging with the business when they first join, all the way to when they may leave or they become really, really deep within the organization. And so being able to think about that as kind of one customer experience and then aligning the teams that are designing the experiences across all of those with reusable components and different kind of personas and how they can use.
Those components are mapped to are created and developed and then mapped to the overarching brand persona, right? And that allows you to rapidly build within those platforms, right? So you touched on a lot of level 4 things right there, right? I think maybe you can formalize what that level 4 looks like now that we've asked those right questions. Now we're here, we have an established, mature CXD practice.
Yeah, exactly. And so we typically see a couple things that indicate that an organization or a team is at the stage. The biggest one is that they have someone who's responsible on growing the conversational AI or conversational design team or practice. So this is usually someone with the VP or director level, but it's now someone whose job it is specifically to think about conversation design or conversational AI as a whole. Whereas previously that may have been a subset under a product team. But this is what we start to see as teams go from kind of emerging to established, is once you have someone whose sole job it is to think about this as a part of their own responsibilities, that's when you start to see a lot of these efficiencies start to happen. And you start to see it grow from a conversation design team or a conversational AI team to a conversational AI practice. And so we start to have multiple projects, multiple teams that are able to work together. And that kind of brings us to the next stage. But even just being here is pretty forward thinking when it comes to companies. And we're seeing a lot of teams that we work with be at this stage or kind of start getting to this stage, and the conversations that it starts to open up. And I think the light that it shines on the conversational AI team and the conversational AI product from leadership just starts to kind of grow quite a bit. Yeah, and just kind of looking at this too, this is where you start to see a slight shift in the process. So overall, it looks very similar to what it did previously, but now you have a team that is a bit more specialized and starts to work together. So you'll see a couple new entries here. You'll see content on the design side. So we'll usually see it not just be UX designers anymore, but we now have roles that are really specific for different parts of that. So we have someone who's just focused on the design and figuring out how do we get a customer from point A to point B. We typically have someone who's now focused on content. So what kind of copy is the most effective copy to be able to do? So someone just writing content. And you also have someone who is responsible for user testing. And so previously in that kind of level 3 category, the designer would do all of these. So the UX designer would write the copy, they would design the flow, figure out the logic, and then actually do user testing themselves. In an established org, these start to become split up and specialized. So it's now not just a UX designer, but it's a conversation design team. So you have a designer, the user testing, and the content writer, who are all part of a team together. And these teams now all start to work together in a much more effective way. So rather than it just being kind of business problem, product design, send it to the development team, which is still a cycle, the cycle starts to become more refined. And so we see teams start to actually introduce data science earlier on in the process, where data science and the design team actually start to work together to figure out what intents and utterances and production entities can we use to actually start building this out in the most effective way. And so the design, the designers themselves actually ends up leveling and becoming a bit more technical to understand what type of logic do I need, what type of data am I working with. And so the designs that they're creating, one, are much more complex, but they're actually much closer to what the development team needs to actually be able to build. We also see as teams get to this stage, the organization itself tends to be much larger. And so we see these teams also having to interact with legal, PR, marketing, all different sorts of stakeholders who want to make sure that the experience is consistent across the customer journey. And so we start to see much more of a kind of detailed cycle that continuously gets optimized as teams start to figure out like how can they take a problem and turn it into a product, test it and push it to market as quickly as they can.
So then great, we made it almost to the end, right? We're at level 4, pretty healthy, established org, but yet there is that level 5 that we've started to identify, which would be optimized. So what do we see here in terms of tech and talent? But then what are maybe the couple questions we can ask to really take that last step?
Yeah, absolutely. So here is where an organization starts to go from a team to a practice. And so there are 2 real thoughts here. So, the thought that's always going on is how can I make this product, like this process, more efficient? How can I help better align, the technology that my data science team, my development team, my product team, and my design team are using to figure out how we can, design, leverage code, leverage tens, other entities in a way that helps us move fast. So that's always being thought of. But the thing that really starts to differentiate teams from level 4 to level 5 is that idea of I'm not just thinking about a team anymore, I'm thinking about growing out of practice. And so we start thinking about how do we create a kind of centrally managed conversation design org within the larger organization that is kind of an equivalent to UX or to another partner. How do we up-level and train new conversation designers? How do we develop career paths? And how do we make sure that, as conversation design teams start to be spun up, we can actually reuse components, reuse entities, reuse intents from other teams across the org. And so it becomes much more kind of systems and organizational thinking than just kind of team flywheels. And we're starting to see some of the kind of leading, the kind of top tier of the tech companies or top tier kind of retail or finance companies be at this stage where they're actually trying to figure out what this looks like. So they've kind of figured out the level 4 where they're established and they're figuring out the processes, but now they're actually growing the practice and becoming conversation design leaders. And so some of the kind of marquee points are that teams have a formalized conversation design team, and again, a VP or director. So a lot of the same stuff you saw previously, but you start to see multiple orgs that are kind of grouped under a center of excellence.
I think this graph tells the whole story in terms of like 4 to 5 though, to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in level 4, we had 1 of these. In level 5, we have 2 or many more that are all kind of grouped together under a conversation design center of excellence. So what really happens is that as one team, creates new components, creates new processes, creates things that they can figure it out, all the other teams that are connected to it start to also increase the efficiency. And so design teams are able to talk to each other, product teams are able to talk to each other, and really figure out how we can grow as an organization and take on new projects and kind of just keep spinning that flywheel efficiency. And this is where we see a lot of teams kind of working towards. And so we're kind of excited to be able to figure out those. But I think as we figure out this level 5th of this kind of stage or the new frontier of where teams go, we'll be sure to keep you updated. But I think a good example is thinking about UX or UX design as an industry 10 years ago, where it was very much in the same category, where you had level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and you had UX teams and leading companies who had UX designers on their teams figuring out processes, to today where you have UX organizations as a core partner in your company, where product is thought of as a partnership between development, product teams, and UX teams. Really the future here is for conversational AI products to be thought of in the same partnership where you have a new conversation design org within your company.
Absolutely. Great. Well, then I think we made it through all 5. I think let's hop over to this graphic as we maybe open it up to questions here. I think this is probably a good place to leave it here in terms of visuals, just because we can reference it very easily. But maybe before Daniel jumps into this kind of last thought here, if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand, hop on the chat or audio and yell them out. Happy to answer these live or after the fact. But I do think, Daniel, for this last one, this is kind of everything we just talked about at a 10,000 foot view again, as well as kind of looking at the different stages of tech and talent. I think what the biggest thing that I think I'm taking away, in our conversations as we work with different groups, as well as just like what you went through today, is that this is this is not something that you have to go 0, then to 1, then to 2, then to 3. Like we are seeing some orgs, and we might even recommend it, go from a 1 to 3 or a 0 to 3. One, would you recommend that? And two, if so, any extra tips for teams that are looking to do that larger jump?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it really depends on your org, and I think the difference today compared to 5 years ago, where a lot of the teams that are at this level 4, level 5, had started and they were kind of working towards. There's a difference in technology, and so you see kind of conversation design tools today that allow you to go from the drag and drop design canvas to actually being able to generate live code in the background that can then be plugged in directly into an end system. And so what we're seeing is, a lot of this technology has emerged within the last year or so, and what it's allowing teams to do is really skip from that first part to the third part, where they may have an outsourced team, but they want to be able to build it in-house. But rather than taking a huge kind of budget ask and allocating it directly to a development team who needs to build everything from scratch, they're able to actually take that budget and equally allocate it to a development team and a design team or a product team that is leveraging modern technology to be able to do a lot of the development work that you used to need multiple developers to be able to actually do. And so that's where we kind of see the biggest jump. And what it does do is it allows you to skip a lot of the pain that you typically feel when you're building an in-house team. Like building an in-house development team for a new product that has very high volume and is customer facing is very difficult, very painful. And that's why usually teams that are at this stage, it's so hard to move away from it, because as you build, you kind of accumulate more and more technical debt, or you have more and more homegrown tools that really rely on specific use cases that end up creating more limitations. But if you're able to kind of skip that phase from the get-go, would definitely recommend it. But it also requires an organization or champions in an organization that are really kind of thinking there and are able to get the backing to be able to take that leap.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I think I wanted to make that sure that was clear, because I don't want someone to watch this and think, oh, I have to go along this path. This is going to be a 10-year plan. This is the only way to mature. It's not, right? It's not. You just have to make sure that if you're going from scratch, you have to equally invest on that dev and design and prototype side of things, so that you're creating that foundation evenly, solidly from scratch, and not having to reverse engineer to get outside the box that you built yourself into in this space, at least.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much like, if I wanted to say walk to the grocery store, and the grocery store is, an hour away. I could walk there, I could do it. I could build a muscle, and, it gets easier and easier every day. Or I could leverage the tools that are available to me, right? I could take a bus, I could take an Uber, I could take a car, take a bike, whatever it might be. And that really allows me to kind of get to that point faster. And the way I think about it is, when you think about your org and getting to a modern process, right? So whether that is a open-ended conversation driven via chat, an assistant that's proactive, et cetera. I think the quickest way to be able to catch up to people who have built this muscle in-house years and years and years is to be able to adopt tooling, right? Figure out what tools are out there, what works best for you, and what can help augment your team to be able to get from that level 1 to 3 as quickly as possible, and take your organization from maybe being a bit legacy to being modern without having to go through all the same pain that someone who did it all in-house did. And so that's kind of how I like to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I will leave it on this question slide for a second, as I know some people might be hopping at the top of the hour here. But for most of all, if anyone has any questions, you can drop them now. Send them via email to either of us. We'll send out a recap and a recording of this after the fact to anyone who signed up. But most of all, Daniel, thank you for spending the time to do this. I think this is the type of content, this is the type of open forum that we want to have around real topics that we're talking with large enterprise teams every day about, right? And I think if anyone's obviously on those teams here, or is maybe joining a team like that, we want to be able to continue those conversations and talk about it openly, because just as we saw, there's not many companies that are at number 5 yet. They're working towards it, right? But no one's there yet. No one's figured it all out yet. So we're part of the conversation here. So thank you for sharing all your knowledge.
Yeah, happy to be here. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, we also had a question just now here. So what are some effective collaboration strategies or processes for content and design? So you showed the large wheel, but what does the mini wheel look like within content and design, especially in some of those established teams where you have both roles, for example?
Yeah, I'd be curious to kind of see the tooling behind this. Typically where we see it being a challenge is when those two teams or those two individuals, whether it's content and design, often have to work in different tools, right? So a lot of times we see content teams either having all their scripting in like a Word doc or an Excel doc or somewhere, and then you have the design team that has a much more kind of technical looking design that's really focused less on the content and what the user's saying and what a bot is saying, and more on the actual technical specifications of, a user might say something like this, we're going to go through 3 different things, collect these variables, and then system says this. And so that's usually where we see the disconnect, is when they're working in different tooling. Where we've seen teams really work effectively, and what's kind of interesting is the roles are blend a bit together. So, dedicated content person finds that they're not just doing content anymore, but they have a little bit more stake in this. They're actually kind of contributing to the design too, is when they're using the same tooling. And so that's really where I've seen the most effective. And just kind of give an example from ourselves with Voiceflow is because within the tool itself, you're able to actually put in the copy and hear what it sounds like and generate a real prototype. And there's other tools that you can look at as well. What that allows is that it allows the content writer to be able to see what does the actual end experience look like, because it's hard to determine what effective content is if it's not in motion or someone's not interacting with it. And it also helps the designer understand, how can I better design this to make sure that the content shines in the best way. And so the teams that we have, content writers and designers working closest together, are when they're using a kind of collaborative tool set that allows them to actually see what that experience looks like in real life, because both of those team members are really our partners in kind of creating that experience.
Yeah, and another tactical thing I'll add on that I've heard in a few conversations is, and it seems simple, but just like having a standard place for feedback and commenting and actually not even just like collaborating on the design, but collaborating in communication. Like, I think that is so important, where a lot of times people are like, oh, I did it in Slack, I dropped that in comment on Airtable, I put that in XYZ. Like, having one spot that you're going to have a conversation about your design is to me is like the biggest workflow unlock for designers and content people that we've spoken with.
Yeah, totally. And what actually happens too is, like, as you have these better processes, you start to find that you're able to kind of collect more feedback from other parts of the org, whether that's a legal stakeholder that needs to approve disclaimers in your product because it's very technical or very like financial focused, or it's product manager, or it's a business stakeholder who typically would only be involved at the end of the process and might be disgruntled, and you have to go back and fix everything again. Being able to actually interact with them early on in a way that's not invasive, but it's actually helpful to the process, really kind of helps bring more stakeholders into the product that you're building, and actually results in kind of a better product overall, because you're getting more eyes on it.
Yeah, and not waiting until the presentation to share with the other team, like having that one-to-one, like really quick kind of design team prototype work, and being willing to kind of take risks on a canvas with content and design. I think that makes better work, right? Versus waiting for like the bi-weekly, here's what I designed, now go build content for it. Like, you have to be, as in sync as any other department when you do a handoff, right? That you need to be creating together, I think, from day one, for sure. That's a very good question. That's probably a whole nother chat, right? On that specific part of the workflow. Great. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. Any other questions, feel free to drop, but otherwise we'll wrap it up here. Daniel, again, thank you for hopping in, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Stay tuned for a next conversation, and excited to keep these going as we have more topics that come to the surface. So thanks, Daniel. To everyone else, have a good rest of your day.
And if you have any more questions, like, feel free to drop them in the community as well. All of us are in there. Clients we work that are in there, billion people are in there, and so you can have these conversations. Kind of async, doesn't need to be an event. So super pumped, and yeah, I'll see you all soon.